My Hero Academia chapter 400 opens up with Oyama concentrating really hard on what was in front of him. He hesitantly asked if the person he was seeing was Invisible Girl. Hagakure was on top of the villain Kunieda and just took a second to process that Oyama was looking directly at her. As for why she has no clothes on, well, she's usually invisible. Her hero costume is her birthday suit. This has been the case since the beginning of the story. The last time Invisible Girl was shown like this, a lot of people got really upset. So if this drawing bothers you, let us know in the comments. And if you don't see the big deal, drop a comment too. That way we can see what the general consensus looks like over here. Either way, I'm a fan of her design. I love the hair and oversized eyelashes. Invisible Girl looked at her own hand, which was now visible. Then she looked down at her now totally visible body. And finally, back at her classmate. Suddenly really embarrassed and on the verge of tears, she cried out for Oyama to stop staring, which made Oyama flustered too. He fired his naval lasers as Invisible Girl shrieked and refracted them. She was distraught over her invisibility gimmick being over. Now that she's been seen, her one really interesting thing has been revealed. In canon at least. Horikoshi kinda already gave us her full design before this. She thought to herself that this had never happened before no matter what she did. But she was quick to correct herself since it did happen in the past, when Oyama was exposed as the UA traitor. He tried to shoot Deku, but she jumped into the attack and refracted the beam. After that, she became partially revealed. Invisible Girl thought to herself for a moment. Then she turned to Oyama with realizing eyes. His quirk, it was getting stronger somehow. Oyama didn't respond to this directly. Instead, he said they should focus on burning the overgrown plants down and saving everyone first. And like Fat Gum had said, the plants may keep growing even if the user of the quirk is knocked unconscious. He then asked Invisible Girl to help him by refracting his naval lasers to burn the roots that were spreading inside the other heroes. But with so many big plants to deal with, Invisible Girl wondered if Oyama's stomach would be alright. What Oyama said next was very concerning. He claimed that today was his last day as a student of UA, and so he was ready to go to any lengths necessary. Technically, Oyama was arrested, and technically UA has been destroyed thanks to the fight against Shigaraki. But the emphasis here definitely makes it seem like there's more that he's not saying. That along with the sudden realization that his quirk is getting stronger. I can't be the only one that sees death flags being raised here. Speaking of which, All Might's hover bike that had risen to fire its own laser was on the verge of its end too. Its engines were overheating and his battery was running low. But All Might yelled at the top of his lungs that it needed to keep firing down, and so it didn't stop. This was one hell of a blast, but thankfully All Might was just outside the danger zone. Apparently this maneuver of his was inspired by Star's fight against Shigaraki. Back then, she grabbed hold of a laser and slammed it into the villain. Unfortunately, solidifying the laser wasn't something this suit was capable of. And I'd hope not, that is a reality warping power we are talking about. Either way, the ground was torn asunder. All for One began to crawl his way to the surface like a vengeful zombie, but All Might was ready for him. The front of his armor opened up to reveal a sort of speaker system. Revealing a mechanical quirk inspired by Jiro, All Might released powerful sound waves that would put President Mike to shame. All Might refused to let his nemesis escape the blast radius. He planned on getting in All for One's way until the very end. When he first had the laser systems blare down, it was at the expense of his tentacle gear. He used his remaining thrusters to get out of the way. Apparently, the suit possesses an optical resin feature based on Invisible Girl that gives him more heat resistance. And I'm not so sure I remember that being a feature of her quirk, but it is an interesting angle that makes invisibility an even better quirk than it already is. For the sake of making this combination work, All Might let himself be hit by All for One. He shielded against most of the damage with the help of his tail based on Ojiro's, but unfortunately, his legs were still ruined. Thinking to himself, All Might realized how close he was to dying there. The only reason he was alive was thanks to All for One avoiding his head. Instead of crushing it, the sadistic demon lord wanted to watch as All Might writhes in pain. Even at the expense of his grander dream, All for One can't help himself when it comes to being petty. But it was thanks to this that All Might could still put up a fight and ruin his plans. All for One released a quadruple assault of tentacles that tore into All Might's armor and sent him flying away. The hero braced himself and continued to smile. Lifting an exposed arm, he called upon Momo's creation quirk in the form of armor morphing. All Might admitted to himself that he wouldn't be able to hit All for One any harder than he was right now. Like a desperate Pokemon trainer in front of a legendary, he threw two binding spears based on Mineta's quirk. The technological grapes affixed themselves to All For One's emerging form. All Might needed the guy to just vanish already. The only thing dampening the pain he was feeling right now was a feeling of pure elation and joy. This man All Might is looking like a battle junkie right now, and it is really cool. Cool enough to be watched all over the world. A little boy in a foreign country pointed at the screen to his grandmother, wondering who the skinny guy was. It's clear that he's too young to be super familiar with All Might. In fact, he's part of a generation that doesn't have a symbol of peace. His grandmother wasn't sure who the guy was either. After all, she wasn't too familiar with the whole hero thing, which is pretty surprising. We don't know exactly where this is, but based on their television and clothing, it seems like they're supposed to be from a poorer country. We know from the movies that there are heroes all over the world. The business of heroics has dominated world economies for decades. There's also the fact that All For One supposedly has underworld and villainous connections across the globe. The general assumption is that without heroes, villainy and anarchy will reign supreme. So how could they possibly be so far removed? The boy wondered what would happen if the hero wins and what would happen if he loses. His grandmother's response was that the men on screen were fighting each other in a far-off country. In the end, she believed that this battle of theirs would not have any effect on their lives no matter what happens. That's a pretty bold statement, and one that contradicts a lot of what has been claimed to be the case over the course of the series. It's been reported that governments all across the world have been preparing for the worst against these threats. Japan was utterly devastated by the League of Villains. After that, All For One, the so-called most powerful, dangerous, and infamous villain of all time, was freed from prison. And if that wasn't enough, America's #1 hero, Star and Stripe, was killed by the villains too. And that's a year after the world's most popular and commercially successful hero of all time, All Might, had his retirement match. To be unaware of all that is honestly really impressive. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if they also belong to the 20% of people on the planet that don't have a quirk, just like Deku had been. The boy accepted what his grandmother was saying, but even still, he couldn't seem to take his eyes off the hero he saw on the screen. He leaned ever forward with eager anticipation. He steadied himself as he watched carefully. This is just like when Deku saw that video of All Might saving people in his glory days. What he's seeing is true heroics, maybe even for the first time. Right now, Deku is in a bit of a predicament. One For All is a power that continues to grow stronger and stronger. This is a bit of an issue since the human body can only handle so much. It's gotten to the point where if Deku was born with a quirk and received One For All, he would have died prematurely, maybe even exploded. The only way the power can live on is by being passed down to a person without a quirk, of which there are becoming less and less. To then find someone with a truly heroic spirit from that pile is next to impossible. Which is all to say that this boy could very well prove to be Deku's eventual successor, if One For All manages to live on beyond this final clash between Deku and Shigaraki, and is still needed, that is. In time, the hover bike finally met its explosive end. All Might looked up at it in panicked acknowledgement. Everything progressed slowly from then as he waited for the dust to settle. Then came the inevitable mockery of All For One. He began pulling himself from the rubble while regenerating. He reminded All Might of his stance that tools cannot surpass their limits. Now, one thing I can't help but notice here is All For One's hair, specifically the top of it. It almost looks like there's a splash of color, or at least a different color on top, which kind of reminds me of our good old main character, Deku. All Might thinks he's keeping All For One from blindsiding Deku, but maybe he's just getting in the way of a father returning with milk from the store and reuniting with his son. For as much as we've seen the villain, Horikoshi continues to shroud his face with the help of various obscurities. It might even be the case that Invisible Girl's earlier comment about the worn novelty of her mysterious appearance was a reference to what is to come for the villain. And similarly to Hagakure, All Might noticed that All For One's body was shining. He insulted his now younger opponent while preparing for what was to come. The luminescent and grotesque creature wondered what happened to his dear friend's smile. And oddly, in this twisted game of his, I do think that he considers All Might to be as close to a friend as he can possibly fathom. Then again, he seems to call everyone his friend. But just before he made his move, the villain suddenly froze, as if transfixed. All Might watched closely with unrealized expectancy. All For One couldn't move. All Might suddenly hit the jets and rushed in towards All For One. He remembered the question of a fanatic criminal that had recently risen a sword to his throat. Who was he really? It's the same question that All Might's best friend Tsukauchi asked when he first saw this glorious display. It's a very without the power, what are you sort of thing. The hero once again had a massive smile on his face as he continued forward. As standing atop a crazy glider like the Green Goblin, a man proclaimed that we all bleed the same red blood. All Might's smile was glorious as a venom-like tongue licked the demonic blood left on a piece of rubble. Stain is here. The hero killer cried out with his blade in hand that All Might needs to take All for One down. Absolutely legendary performance from these guys. Horikoshi has to be in better spirits these days thanks to all the All Might excitement. The final moments of the Dabi and Toga fights were good in their own ways, but for better or worse, weren't so collectively well received. For some, the whole Dabi thing felt like a really long family hug at the end of a therapy session, and the Toga fight felt like it should have ended a lot sooner. Regardless of your stance, we can all admit that those fights were a lot more emotional. This All Might fight has brought us back to themes more typical of shonen stories. We've got hype new transformations, new power reveals, the long-awaited return of a legend, a highly anticipated rematch between two characters that defined power in this world and already had one of the best fights in the whole series. Besides being a grudge match, it's an underdog story, and the stakes are especially high because of Sir Night Eye's prophecy that All Might will be killed. All Might is an ailing man pushing well beyond his own limitations to bring smiles to others. Horikoshi has admitted that the things he writes and draws impact both his thinking and mood. Creating All Might's final fight could very well be empowering his own drive to see the story to its end despite his own health concerns. I'm just really happy to be here for the ride, and I'm glad you are too. One of our earliest videos on the channel was one covering the fact that the last time All Might fought All for One, his trademark smile was totally missing. That whenever times actually got rough, All Might continuously failed to smile. So I can't help but smile at seeing how he's looking in this final fight. As always, I'm Sliceable Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.